I'm Farhan Dalla, transformational trainer, and welcome to Elevate Your Life, a transformational podcast, an invitation to take the journey towards your deepest self. It is my intention to inspire you to connect, move, and meditate. We'll tap in, tune in, and dive in, and together learn and reflect from authentic, real, and transformative conversations. Let's get started.
In the car, Tehzeeb decided to draw a Navroz card for Aya's uncle. He drew the traditional wheatgrass roji and tied it with a ruby red ribbon. He decorated the card with tall tulips, rainbow-colored eggs, and spring bumblebees all buzzing around. He couldn't wait to show Aya's uncle. When they arrived, Aya's uncle's house was decked with fairy lights twinkling above the bricks, colorful streamers hugging the porch columns, and dozens of balloons on either side of the front door. This seems different, thought Tehzeeb. As much as Aya's uncle and Rahima loved to decorate for Navroz, this seemed a bit over the top. What was going on? Tehzeeb's parents looked puzzled too. He followed them across the front yard. Before they could even knock, the door swung open. Aya's uncle grinned at them, his arms spread wide. Acho, acho, under acho. Come in, everyone. Navroz Mubarak.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to a very special edition of Elevate Your Life, a transformational podcast. And that was an excerpt from the book titled Mehndi Boy, read by the author himself and my guest today, Zain Bandali. Welcome.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for being here and for sharing this book with the world. I have lots of questions for you, and I can't wait to share your story and talk about the book. But let's continue with your impressive introduction with this bio. Zain Bandali is an author, poet, and unapologetic diversity advocate. His debut children's book, Mehndi Boy, is a Silver Birch Express nominee and was recognized as a best bet by the Ontario Library Association and as a best book for kids by the New York Public Library in 2023. Zain studied at the University of Waterloo and was awarded the Upcar Aurora Social Impact Leadership Scholarship for his work in creating a grassroots community initiative. Even in his day job as an HR professional at a leading financial corporation, Zain strives to bring the values of diversity, equity, and inclusion to everything he does. He is an avid vegetable gardener, but cannot always stomach the chili peppers he grows. Zain, welcome to the show.
Thank you for the warm introduction.
Okay, so how hot are these chili peppers?
Oh man, so one year I grew a Carolina Reaper, which is like the hottest, I believe at that point it was the hottest in the world. And I think I used a portion of it in a salsa, and it was a really good salsa. But I've gifted, ghost peppers, which are, quite less in Scoville units to like aunties and uncles, and they've complained to me that like, Zain, like, what have you given us? Like, this ruined our kukupaka. I'm so sorry.
So kukupaka is a Indo-African dish made of chicken, coconut cream, and eggs, I believe, right?
Yeah, it's a really delicious, yummy curry.
Okay, when I used to eat meat, I believe that the kukupaka was not spicy. So I can imagine to the dismay of your family members,
They were
right? You
shocked. They
burned
were
their
not
tongue.
expecting that at all. And I'm like, I'm
Right,
sorry, guys. I should have warned you, but
right. And I personally am not a chili person. I can't handle hot, spicy food. So I'm somewhat of a boring, eater. And maybe I'm letting down my ancestors in that way.
ancestors, yeah.
But nonetheless, my stomach thanks me. So that's great. So Zain, congratulations on the publication of your book. How does it feel?
It's honestly surreal. It's something that I kind of dreamed about for a while and, always saw the publication date, but actually seeing it like, go to Eaton Center and I see it at the Indigo there, like it's honestly surreal having gone to schools now to actually read to kids and they
Mhm.
come up to you like, this was my favorite book. And you're just like, what? Okay, you read it? Amazing. And it's really amazing. And I'm so honored to have also received the Silver Birch Express nomination, which is
Mhm.
huge, one for like a debut novel, but number two is just like that truly shows that other folks too see the impact of what you've written. And I'm so deeply touched that I was, provided with a nomination. And who knows, maybe I'll win. We don't know. I'll find
Yeah.
out in May. But yeah,
And based on the bio that I just read, impressive, by the way,
thank you.
um, you've always made an impact in some way, and that's always been a part of you. And can you tell us a bit about this award that you got, the APGAR Aurora Social Impact Leadership? What does that involve, and why did you receive it?
For sure, yeah. So this was during my time at the University of Waterloo. In around 2018, I actually founded an organization on campus called QTPOC KW, or Queer Trans People of Color Kitchener-Waterloo. And in 2020, I was recognized with that award, essentially for starting this grassroots initiative. It was essentially started with the intention of filling the gaps of what mainstream LGBTQ plus organizations were doing on campus. And we thought that racialized students, specifically students who followed religion or, were from a racialized background, Black or Indigenous, or people of color, really didn't find a space in mainstream spaces on campus. Even though they were very established, we felt like our racialization really didn't have an effect. Our cultures didn't have, any semblance of seeing themselves being represented. And so I thought, why not? Why not create a group kind of similar to other groups that have existed and popped up? There's one in Guelph. There's a UT BIPOC Mississauga that's sprung up there. Um, there's different groups in the suburbs and different campus communities that have erupted with essentially trying to create space for these unique intersections that we live in. We did an art showcase, we did discussion groups, we participated in a film festival, Rainbow Reels. We were a part of a Unity Iftar, which was an LGBTQ plus um, open, welcoming iftar for folks at that intersection as well. So there's so many really cool events we did under QTPOC-KW, and I'm glad that I was able to create something that still exists today and serves quite a number of students at Waterloo and the greater KW community.
I love that. And I love that how you are making a huge social impact on many levels, including children, as well as people at the university level, because all of us matter and all of us deserve to be seen. And you have a strong voice in representing us. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
Yeah, Zane, as you know, each one of us has a very unique coming out journey. And I was wondering if you could touch a bit about yours today.
Sure. Yeah. I don't know where I should start, but I guess I'll begin with I was around 19 at the time. And for me, coming out really wasn't about, liking boys as much as it was just how my gender was kind of changing. This is around like first or second year of university. I have a nose ring that I got around that time. I started wearing shawls and, a little bit more different clothing that you would consider for a straight boy my age. And so when I finally told my parents, I know I was like massaging my mom's feet, and I was like, yeah, I don't really like girls. And she's like, what? Say that again. And then I said it again, and I'm like, I don't really like girls. And she's like, okay.
How old are you at that point? Sorry, you're 19?
I feel I was around 19 at that
Okay.
point, yeah. And
Mhm.
then she's like, say it again, maybe repeat it. And she's like, okay. And then she kind of talks to my dad. She's like, did you hear that? And then he's like, yeah. And then I think he either goes for a walk or something, and then it's just me and my mom chatting for a bit. And then later, my mom's like, so what do you think to my dad? And then he's like, well, it's your body, it's your soul, it's your Allah. Just be a good person. Like, that doesn't matter to me. And that was probably one of the most affirming moments because I honestly wasn't sure how my parents would take it. They'd
Mhm.
always been somewhat progressive, but also, had made comments in the past like, oh, I hope we don't have a gay son in the family or something like
Oh,
that.
they said that. Okay.
At different points, I've even heard like an uncle call another person a chakka, or which means a derogatory slur, which means a gay person in Hindi, but like very derogatory equivalent to the F
Mm.
slur.
Right.
And so, a lot of them have come a long way, and it was never like I'd say growing up very homophobic, but you'd hear some kind of shady things. But I
Right.
think the moment of me actually coming out was very positive and showed that like my parents were totally okay with it. They'd met, previous partners of mine, or one or two of them at least, and it was really quite nice to be kind of welcomed by my immediate family, and nothing really changed. And I think for them, it was like, it made sense. They're like, we always had an idea, but we didn't know how to bring it up. But um, it really paved the way for me in a sense too, to have that conversation quite early on. I think I was quite lucky that, I was able to have that and be welcomed by my parents. Yeah.
That's great. I'm glad that you had that support. Now, do you have any siblings or cousins that you spoke to about, coming out, and how did
Yeah.
that go?
So I do have a younger brother, and I know actually initially when I came out, he didn't really understand what gay meant. He's
Mhm.
like, "Oh, I thought it was like a bad word." And it's like, "I didn't realize you were gay," like 2 weeks later. I'm like, "You were literally there. You didn't take that in that I came out." Obviously that's not the case anymore. And I think he's kind of on his own journey too when it comes to all these things. And so I think we've kind of supported each other, and even other cousins, even with them much older than me, like in their 30s at the time, were like, yeah, like Zain, we're so proud of you. And very much later on even came out in a sense to me, sharing that they were bi, or were definitely had been in queer relationships before, but didn't really have the space to share that with me. And even for a lot of the allies, they've been huge in terms of just supporting me, even with the launch of Mehndi Boy and just coming out and supporting me no matter what. So I've been very lucky to have cousins that have been great allies to me through this process.
That's great. I want to shift gears and talk about Mehndi Boy. I have a copy right here, and it's great. I love the illustrations, um, and the story of Thésée. But why don't I give you an opportunity to tell us all about what this book is about? Who is it for, and why did you write it?
For sure, yeah. So Tizib, like you said, is the main character. It's really about his journey with this ancient form of body art expression that he kind of just stumbles upon during kind of what I mentioned earlier, or read earlier through the excerpt, was through a Nowruz gathering that he attends. So they're celebrating the Persian New Year with friends and family, and that's kind of his first exposure to what Mehndi was. As a very fashion-loving, stylish young boy, like he really enjoyed it and picked it up quite quickly. And the entire book is kind of his evolution of wanting to express himself through Mehndi, just as any other art form, whether it's like sketching or like, painting. And most people in his community and his family are very excited for him, except for his Ayaz uncle, who kind of struggles with what he sees as something that's for girls. And so that's kind of the main sort of plot development, or the issue in the story is how does he navigate this relationship with his favorite uncle, like, that he's now disappointing with his love for Mandy. And so kind of takes you through a lot of the Indo-Tanzanian Ismaili experience, the words in Kutchi, Gujarati, Swahili. It goes through a lot of like Ismaili themes too. There's a lot of Easter eggs. If you're an Ismaili Muslim, you'll notice some very unique parts of the illustrations that I was quite,
Hmm.
intentional when chatting with Jani Balakumar, my illustrator, about making sure I have aspects of my identity and the specificity of my identity throughout. So it's all about pushing gender norms in a kid-friendly way and really questioning like, hey, why is this any different than any other kind of art form? And the question to the answer, or the answer to that question is it's not. It is very much the same thing. It is art, and the only reason why we don't do it is just because, back in the day, pink wasn't
Hmm.
for girls, it was a boy color. Heels were worn by, French dignitaries. They're not worn anymore. The thing is, gender changes. And in that sense, I really wanted to push a boundary and just kind of really ask that question. Why not? Why
Yeah.
are we so scared of a little boy putting flowers on his hand? Right.
Yeah, I love that. And I have a bit of a Mendy story myself.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, well, I think honestly, I was in my 30s, and it was my brother's wedding. And I had Mehndi done on my entire back, and it went from like my neck down to my waist, and my all my arms. It was like, and the running joke was that mine took longer than the bride's to actually do. But I mean, no one really saw it because I had a shirt and a suit on during the ceremonies, but I did take some pictures and whatnot. But that was sort of like my first, I want to say, major experience with like trying Mehndi, and not in my mind did I think at that time, was this for girls or boys? But in thinking back to my childhood, it was not something that I saw my dad or my brother wear.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, and you and I come from the exact same background. Like I have origins from East Africa. I was born in Tanzania and ancestry from India, just like yours. And I have to say, this is the first book that I've come across where I could completely see myself in and relate to. I mean, everything, like you said, from the illustrations, which was very intentional. And I definitely picked up on those references, but also from the foods, the culture. I honestly wish that there was a book like this when I was a child growing up. And so I think that if I had, I would have felt maybe seen. And in a world where it didn't always feel so inclusive. And so was that your experience, or do you have a similar experience growing up as well?
Absolutely. And like, let me talk about growing up a bit more. Like, I would say for me, Mandy, just as like the nose piercing happened, the shawl kind of happened around the first few years of university, Mandy became one of the first expressions of mine to really explore my queerness because it was something that, I think we often see as a form of femininity in our culture. But it was a really beautiful art form that I just started doing all the time and like practicing on myself. And actually, even yesterday, we had some Navroz celebrations at my Jamaat Khana, which I go to Tobacco Jamaat Khana in Toronto. And I have been asked for the past like 7 years to like essentially go and do Mehndi for the aunties, for the kids. And I'm there with the other Mehndi artists. And so I don't claim to be the best at all. I'm pretty mediocre, not like Tazib, but just being recognized by my community and seen as someone who can very much be a part of that as well. And I think that's really the crux of it all, is like the fact that I in my own community am a Mehndi boy who does Mehndi at Kushalis and celebrations, and growing up it was something I loved doing. So in that same sense, I was like, why not encourage other boys to do it? Because like you, it was like I kind of noticed growing up that boys didn't do it, and I loved it. So I thought it was strange, and I was like, why is that? And I really
Mhm.
want to deconstruct it. And what you mentioned about that specificity, like that was like, completely intentional.
Mhm.
A lot of times East Africans like to joke that we're a dying breed.
Mhm.
Which is interesting because a lot of us, like at least my parents came in like the 70s and 80s. Some of us are first or second gen. Um, for me, I wasn't born in Tanzania. I was born in Canada, and I very much grew up though with that like mixed fusion culture. And I often call it a diaspora of a diaspora because that's truly what we were. We lived, a lot of us, our families in East Africa for 4 generations. We developed a Creole in our language. It was a mixture of Gachi and Swahili. We, as the Smileys, have such a unique experience too of language, of shared culture. The fact that we're celebrating the Persian New Year with a Indo-Tanzanian family, celebrating, African foods and heritage with a South Asian art. I really wanted to bring all of that together because I think that's oftentimes what the Aga Khan, who's the spiritual leader of these Smileys, talks about as pluralism. This idea that like let's not just tolerate each other, but let's actually celebrate one another. And even if we are different, so what? Like we can still build, we can still grow, we can still contribute to a society together. And that's what I wanted to really show is like, there's a lot of intentional representation, even just of different folks in the book. I wanted to show like a Punjabi Bibi as the neighbor. I wanted to show, the different races of children lining up to get their mehndi done. I wanted to show a lot of that uniqueness. And so a little bit of a long-winded answer, but I hope that kind of demonstrates why it was so important for me to write.
Yeah, and it feels to me that there's a tribute in your book towards our
Mm,
culture, like you said, to celebrate its uniqueness and the way that we've adapted, many cultures and created our own. And this story centers around, at the beginning, the celebration of Navroz, which you mentioned. And this week, we are, in fact, celebrating Navroz. It takes place on March 21st. And Navroz is a festival that marks the beginning of a new year. It is celebrated by Ismaili Muslims as well as Persians worldwide. It signifies a time of spiritual renewal, rejuvenation. It's a time for gratitude and blessings, and beginning our new year with the spirit of hope and optimism. What what does Navroz signify for you, and why did you particularly choose that holiday in this book?
There's a bunch of different reasons. They'll say the first one would be like, I think we've heard about the Eids. We've heard about Eid al-Adha, we've heard about Eid al-Fitr. Nowruz or Nowruz, as you correctly explained, is the Persian New Year. It's something that is not just for Persians, it's also for Afghans, Central Asians, Tajik communities, Baha'i, Zoroastrian, other Muslim groups that live in those regions, and Ismailis. Like it's a very unique holiday that's again not just celebrated in Persia, it's celebrated in East Africa and now in Canada and India, like where the diaspora went. And so I really wanted to pay a tribute, like you said earlier, to this unique festival. And in a lot of senses, Nowruz is important to me as someone who loves to garden, as that first kind of beginning of like, now we want to sow seeds. Now we want to, finally say bye to that winter. And in a way, it's the better new year. Because rather than try to force resolutions in the dead of winter, where we're trekking through, snow and icy conditions, Nowruz is about that time where we're now going with spring. We're going at a time of renewal, perhaps when the new year should have been, rather than the Gregorian one, which throwing some shade to them. Um, but it made sense to me. So I've always had a personal fascination with this time of year, just because I love how it really speaks to me as at a time of rebirth and renewal.
Mhm.
One that again goes with nature rather than against nature.
Yes, and it's definitely a more welcomed time of year, as you mentioned here in the city of Toronto. Um, I love this. On the release day of Mehndi Boy, you say it took a lot of energy, a lot of believing in myself, a lot of fighting imposter syndrome, and a lot of showing up for my inner child, reminding myself that my truth, my queer, South Asian, Indo-Tanzanian, Ismaili self deserved to tell a story that truly represented my journey. Tehzeeb represents me, my boldness, my desire to dream of a world where artistry in boys is celebrated, where femininity is not a weakness, but a superpower, where families rise up to celebrate the whole child, even if it goes against stubborn gender norms. Um, how much of Tehzeeb is in you and how much of you is in Tehzeeb? Is that the right way to phrase that question?
That's an interesting way to put it, actually. So when I go to school visits, a lot of times I'm actually asked if Aya's uncle is me, because I guess I kind of look like him.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I know he kind of is me. Like, not really, but he does kind of look like me. I needed him to be a zaddy, if you will, as intentional. Like, he has to look a nice haircut. It just so happened that Johnny created a character that was very, a very dapper looking uncle.
Right.
But to
But he's
Z,
family, so he's got to have some,
yeah.
qualities that physically look like you. I can see that.
Yeah, for sure. And maybe he is. I think there's a part of me that wasn't open to queerness initially, even though I was often called gay, by my peers for a very long time before even I knew what that meant. And I think there was that like, um, even for queer people, we really do need to break barriers and for ourselves and come to terms with our identity. And so, in a way, even if you have a stubborn uncle, I think it's kind of indicative that like we're all kind of on a journey, like whether you're queer or not, like understanding and accepting queer and trans people does take work, even if we're part of that community. But to answer your question initially, Daisy is very much representative of my inner child. You know, while it's not me, it's not my life in the sense that I lived that story, it's very much inspired by like a niche experience of maybe even asking the question, like, what if I was from a young age encouraged to do Mehndi? What if I was able from a young age to really like hone in on those skills and practice on everyone and really get to like celebrate, right? And so he is me, but he's also not me. He's kind of my wish for a future where
Mm.
that could be a reality.
And he could also be someone reading this book right now and seeing themselves in Tezib.
Absolutely. And there's so many like little, young boys where like their moms will send me a picture on Instagram, be like, this is my son. Like he wanted to do Mehndi before Navroz, and like, or other kids who come up to me and tell me like, oh, you're the author. Like I really loved your book. And like, I do Mehndi too now. And I'm like, it's honestly just so heartwarming to know that like this, ancient form of art is still being celebrated. And for the first time, like we're pushing it in a way that like even boys can enjoy it too. And
Yeah.
not be shamed for like literally wanting to draw like a flower or soccer ball on their hand, which really seems so basic.
Right.
But the thing about, gender norms is sometimes they don't make sense. And so this is the way of just pushing it and be like, hey, why not? Right?
Right. I remember I was in Paris last fall and I saw a portrait at the Louvre, or a painting, and it was little boys in little dresses. And if I hadn't read the description, I wouldn't have known if it was a boy or a girl. But aside from that, once I read the description, I realized that the idea of boys wearing dresses is not new. Like originally, this was all okay until some of this came about and somebody decided, no, that's for girls.
Mm.
But there was a time where that was not even a conversation. Like that was just considered okay.
Yeah. It's very fickle in that sense, where it's like even the idea of like, for instance, in an Islamic sense, there's kol or kajal, which is sunnah. So men actually, according to sunnah, the Prophet Muhammad's life and following his life would actually put eye makeup, like literally eyeliner, and that's okay. But if we
Mm.
want to talk about mehndi, sometimes we get a raised eyebrow where it's like, actually, no, why not? And
Yeah.
there are actually a bunch of cultures worldwide. In Sudan, for instance, where men actually will put henna on during wedding ceremonies. And even in the South Asian context, maybe not where we're from in terms of the diaspora in East Africa, it was uncommon. But there are, and even in Pakistan and India, like there are in more village contexts where men actually do put mehndi on, and it's not actually seen as weird. But it's interesting how even like one diaspora of people can really shift a narrative over a couple of generations. And so now it's kind of not really doing anything different, but shifting back to what we
Mm.
actually were always doing.
Thanks to books like Mehndi Boy and to your work. So thank you for that. And I love this. You say in an Instagram post, borders and binaries are colonial constructs. To dismantle them, I look to my ancestors, both blood and chosen. I learn from their struggles and victories. I learn from their poetry, art, legacies, activism, and resilience. I remind myself that my people have always existed. Healers, poets, saints, teachers, musicians, the list is endless. I belong to this lineage. Can you talk a little bit about this? I love what you've
Love
written here.
to.
Yeah.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I want to say thank you for like reading my Instagram so intently. It's honestly been a while since I've had these posts in particular very raw and authentic. But I will say for me, my queerness, it was through Islam and it was through my culture that I really came to terms with my queerness, which is really odd to say for other people because a lot of times there's this big like big gap of between like religion sucks and queerness is this and but
Mm.
I think it might be even a generational thing, but for me it was like when I learned about the fact that there are Sufi saints who, very much lived what we would consider now to be queer or homosexual lives that are celebrated in ghazal, in qawwali, in kalam, in poetry, and I can give you a few examples. You will be shocked. There's so many examples of Sufi saints who lived lives that were not heterosexual, who very much were celebrated. They were holy. They are celebrated to this day. Their renditions of songs they continue to be sung, but they very much lived against the grain in traditionally Islamic societies, and they were celebrated in many instances. For instance, there's Shah Hussain, who's also known as Madhu Lal Hussain. He was based in Lahore and is actually buried next to his Hindu lover. So Madhu Lal Hussain is a composite name. It's two people. Madhu Lal was the Hindu lover, and Shah Hussain is the other is the poet himself who wrote a lot of Punjabi kalam. And to this day, a lot of his music is still sung by mainstream Pakistani artists. And again, they're buried together in Lahore. Another example is Siraj Aurangabadi, who lived in the Deccan region of India. Siraj fell in love with a man and wrote a lot about love and ghazal and was actually one of the first to write ghazal in Urdu, which at that point was just written in Farsi. And to this day, he is sung, he's also a Chishti saint. So, he is a holy man who loved men and who to this day is sung by mainstream Qawwali artists, including like the Faridayaz Qawwal group, Abida Perveen, and recently Ali Sethi as well, who's popularized Khabar-e Tahayyur-e Ishq-e-Sun, which is one of these very significant, beautiful ghazals on love. Um, and even if you want to look at Rumi and Shams, another example of what could be seen as whether you want to see it as solely spiritual, if you want to see it as solely queer, I don't really think we can truly know what that love was like. But again, two men, even in the context of third gender people, so what we would maybe consider to be trans women today in the Indian subcontinent, also known as terms like hijra or khwaja sara. These trans women who might have been intersex, might have been what we consider today's gay men. There is a continuum that exists between, these various forms of gender expression, but, you know, they existed throughout history and served in many contexts as eunuchs in the courts of the Mughal rulers. They are extremely spiritual people as well, where they tie in a lot of Hindu and Muslim forms of worship into their own everyday existing. And so the thing about South Asia is we are a deeply spiritual people, even in the guise of queerness. And even if we want to look to the two-spirit siblings of ours that live on Turtle Island, they very much are healers and teachers and warriors even. And so I think when we want to understand queerness and decolonize it a bit, we need to look to our ancestors. And when I say blood or chosen, I personally don't know of queer ancestors in my own blood lineage. I'm not saying they didn't exist, but I didn't know them. But when I say chosen, I can say Siraj Aurangabadi, see him as this like Chishti Awliya or friend of God, or Shah Hussain, Madhulal Hussain, or these other figures like Rumi and Shams, and kind of hold on to them and be like, oh, they existed. These third gender Khwaja Sara or Hijra women, people existed. They are celebrated in context, and also we're not celebrated because of colonization. Um, and so really understanding that like people like me did exist. We are not new. We're not some Western concept, like this rainbow flag is a very new concept. It doesn't mean that people like me didn't exist. And no, I don't need to give the West a trophy for, hashtag love is love. Like, I'm sorry, I don't need to. I can celebrate my queer Sufi awliya who've always existed, and really thank them and call to them in my times of distress and remembering that no, I have an authenticity. I have a reason to exist just as they did.
Thank you for sharing that. Another one of the themes that really stands out in Mehndi Boy is the idea of being true to yourself. And Tehzeeb, your main character, is confused because his favorite uncle tells him Mehndi is for girls, and little Tehzeeb is conflicted because he loves Mehndi, but doesn't want to disappoint his uncle. And isn't it true, like you said, that many of us have faced situations, especially with family members, where we are afraid of being our true selves because we don't want to upset or hurt the people that we love? What advice would you give to anyone who is afraid of being true to themselves because of their fear that it may upset or hurt a loved one?
The first thing that comes to mind is choose your battles because there are times you will need to hide it because it's not always going to be, a situation where there's going to be a happy ending, so to say. I think there's always going to be a happy ending to an extent, but depending on the openness of your parents, depending on the openness of your family, even saying smileys, for instance, like East Africans who have now settled here for at least, we're second, third generation, we're finally at a space where we are able to be pretty okay with queerness. But that is not the same for other folks in the Ismaili community that are from like the Indian subcontinent, from Pakistan, from Afghanistan. We are not there. And so no one is asking anybody to come out. If it's safe for you to do so, then by all means, take that courage and take that first step. Talk to people who are like, your allies, your cousins, even an aunt and uncle that you can trust. Go there, start there, and eventually make the rounds to your parents and immediate extended family if you think that's something you can do. And if that's something you can't do, then no, I wouldn't say come out because it is not something that might be safe for you. I think coming out is also a really white concept. Sometimes we do need to live lives a little bit, not to say you can't be authentic, but you might not be able to be authentic with everybody. Even for me, there's days I'm picking battles. I'm like, do I want to dress more queer today? Do I want to look not as straight, or do I want to look, like I'm celebrating myself? And it's a constant conversation and it changes with time. And I think just giving yourself that ability to like be like, it's okay. It's okay if today I don't want to look a certain way. Especially if I'm going to a family gathering, if I want to tone it down a bit. Or it's okay to also be like, yeah, I'm gonna push boundaries a bit. I'm gonna wear that shawl. I'm gonna say those things at the, Thanksgiving dinner table. Like it really depends. And I'd say you yourself know best what that could look like, right? And so um just to keep that in mind.
Yeah, I think you've touched on important points. Excuse me, your safety is primary, the first and most important thing. And you have to consider that aspect, especially if there's risk of physical harm in that situation. Um, like you said, it is an ongoing conversation that you have with yourself. And I also think the more that you learn to come into terms with not just who you are, but your comfort with that
Mm,
and how you choose to express that, and how that can continue to grow. I mean, I always thought, not always, but after I came out, that I was comfortable with who I was. But last December, I had the opportunity with my family to go on Family Feud. And one of the questions that was asked was around my dating life as a gay man.
mm,
And so now I had this live audience, television cameras in front of me. And it's not to say that I wasn't comfortable with who I was, but after that experience, I felt like I grew into myself a little bit more, even though I didn't think that was even possible. And so I'm seeing how that plays out with not just the way that I express myself verbally, but also non-verbally in the way that I dress, and just a greater degree of comfort, which I didn't even know I could get to. So I like how you said it's situational, but it's something also that grows with you with time.
absolutely. It completely evolves. And I think as I've grown closer with my mother recently too, I think I've been able to really we can't talk about everything, and I
Right.
wouldn't expect that ever because I wouldn't want that either because that would gross me out. But, I think I am happy that, we can get to a point where we're like, oh, that guy was cute. And then, Or
Hmm.
she'll like, unprovoked be like, oh, he was very cute. And I'm like, oh yeah, I know he was. Like we could do cute things like that. Um, so it does evolve and it'll surprise you. And I think
Hmm.
that's one of the blessings of life. And I'm glad that you could be yourself. And even the idea of being your authentic, true self, it really changes with time. And
Yeah.
just, the way I presented when I first came out versus now is totally different.
Mhm.
And maybe I was more in my like twink, femme, skinny boy era back then. And now I'm in my more like otter bear adjacent kind of like,
Uncle Aya's looking sort of.
Uncle Aya's auntie core, like, I'm doing something else. But
Hmm.
as long as you are just happy with whatever that is, that negotiation, and just like, you know what, I feel free. Like,
Yeah.
as long as you feel free that you made a choice, I think that's the most important thing. That's where that happiness comes, right?
Hmm. At the beginning of the series, I talked about my coming out journey. It was the first time I publicly told my story, and I found that really difficult. But after I did, um, it definitely felt good to have done that. And then, like I said, after Family Feud, that even increased my level of comfort. So life will present itself opportunities for you to step into your truth, and it's up to you to decide whether you want to say yes, but no one's going to judge you for it either way.
Absolutely.
And I think your book, Mehndi Boy, is very important and timely in our world today where, the conversation about book banning is on the rise. And we've seen a lot of this in the States, namely in Texas and Florida. But here in Canada, there have been conversations and attempts to ban or restrict books. The Toronto Star last November reported that the Waterloo Catholic District School Board was restricting access to 4 books with LGBTQ themes selected as part of a provincial program intended to engage elementary and secondary school students in reading a diverse range of books. And the CBC just this February reported that according to Canadian librarians, recent challenges primarily involve opposition to books that deal with sexuality, LGBTQ themes, or gender diversity. I mean, I understand this is creating conversation around these topics, but what are your thoughts in regards to the hopes that these conversations will lead to, not just as an author, but also as a member of the LGBTQ plus community?
Yeah. I think these are important conversations to have because why are we even banning books in general? And there's actually a huge market, actually, surprisingly, for banned books. Uh, and what you mentioned too, actually relates to some fellow nominees of the Silver Birch Express and other forced to reading books, where they were shadow banned. And actually, Mehndi Boy could have been one of them, but surprisingly wasn't.
Hmm.
And I wonder, and I laugh many times about this. Um, why wasn't it? Because it's dealing with pushing gender norms, but maybe it's the racialization of it all that still enabled it to be in the hands of kids in that particular school board. And so it's kind of funny. I find it funny where I'm like, you guys are so white that you didn't know what Mandy was. You didn't even find it an issue at Waterloo Catholic District School Board. All right, cool. Um,
Which is
and
also where you went to university, like
in that area in
yeah, in
Waterloo,
that
yeah.
area.
And so it is really interesting. And another question that pops into my mind is like, why are you even publicly funded? Which is an entirely different conversation altogether. Like, why is, a publicly funded institution able to ban books?
Hmm.
Um, At the end of the day, though, I can understand where people are coming from, but I also find it a little bit disappointing. I can understand if it was a private school, but a public, Catholic school board shouldn't be banning books. Doesn't really make sense to me. Um, but I want to talk a little bit more about why I wrote Mehndi Boy the way I did. It's very palatable. It's very respectable. It's very it does something that is quite profound, but in a very, very, I don't know what word to use right now, but in a way that's very subtle. Um, there is obviously the entire fact that we're pushing gender norms. But I was very intentional with how it's being done, how it's being talked about, um, in the ways in which you could give this book even to a Catholic school board and they won't blink an eye. You could give it to more conservative parents and they wouldn't really see it as an issue because, I mean, some might, again, if they're with a South Asian background, they might be like, okay, this is kind of different. But it was intentional that it was still honestly not as loud as other books are in terms of like again that hashtag love is love, rainbows, two boys kissing. Like it's not that. Not to say that those books shouldn't exist, because queer people exist and queer children exist and they should see themselves represented. But it was intentional about going about representation uniquely from the angle of gender. And I am an openly queer author. I've never hidden that fact, but I was intentional that the queerness that I'm portraying is not really queerness in a very loud sense, but queerness through gender and queerness as it is not really about two boys being in a relationship with each other, but a little boy who just wants to do something as simple as do art on his hand, right? And when you break it down to that level, even a conservative, more traditional thinking parent is going to be like, yeah, that's true. Like, why is that an issue? And I think that was really my goal was to make it a book that could transcend barriers. You know, it's still going to, raise an eye, it has in certain ways, but it's still also subtle enough that it can transcend those borders. And if a child really gets a chance to have access to the book and it gets in their hands, then they can have conversations later on. You know what I mean? They can start Googling things, they can start looking into things, they can at least be like, oh, this is a little boy who likes to do art that, people made fun of him or, his uncle didn't really understand. It's for girls usually. And honestly, I do go to schools and I get told maybe 50% of the time, a little boy raises their hand and is really proud to be like, oh, um, this is for girls though. And I have an honest conversation. I talk about pink, I talk about high heels, and I'm like, yeah, boys used to wear them too. And they're like, oh, okay. And you can quite easily shift the narrative. And so that's what Mehndi Boy is really aiming to do. It's aiming to do it in a way where we're not really shaking foundations, so crazily. Again, not saying that those books shouldn't exist, but that wasn't the goal of this book. And I think it makes sense to do that kind of work, especially with the fact that I've been going to Jamaat Khanas for readings, where some other topics are still off the table, but I can still bring this narrative where I'm trying to shift, again, something very basic that maybe one day a child will have that know-how that, people like him can exist. Even if we're not using other very politicized terms or other politicized symbology or symbolism. I don't know if symbology was the right word, but you know what I
I
mean?
do understand what you're saying. And I think it's great. And I love the way that you feel like you've written this book just so fatter of Mac that it's just not like, I want to say loud in any way with your messages, but the messages are very clear.
Hmm. And it can be loud too. It can
Yeah.
100% be loud. And I know
Hmm.
I've definitely had like eyebrows raised where like, folks are like, can I please read your book first? Because again, if they have, you know, if they're really trying to make sure I'm not doing something that's so evil, or as they might think, and
Right.
then they find out, oh, there's nothing. Again, I don't use the term evil, um, but there's honestly a lot of prejudice too with me being a queer author that they just will make assumptions that I'm
Hmm.
trying to, maybe brainwash their kids. I'm like, yeah, I am trying to brainwash their kids to literally think that art is art.
Right.
That's really my goal at the end of the day. Um, this book is not going to make your kid gay, but if your kid is gay, I think it would really help your kid. You know what I mean? And
Hmm.
knowing that like a little boy shouldn't be shamed for, like I said, again, wanting a little flower on his hand,
Hmm.
because I think there's so much violence that toxic masculinity creates. And I think
Hmm.
that's what I'm also trying to tackle as well, is like when you're telling little boys, hey, that's for girls and that's for boys, you're damaging children. You're damaging a child when you're telling them they can't do something and telling them only another gender can do something. You're telling them that there's something wrong with them even wanting to experiment, or you're telling them that there's something that's inherently different. And I think that's very troublesome, right?
Mhm. And it can be very confusing because if you've ever been to the baby section of a store and you're shopping for clothes, it's very designated what is meant for a boy and what is meant for a girl.
Mm,
And so the idea of colors, it's, very distinct. There's not sort of this neutralization of what can a boy wear and what a girl wear. And so I feel like it's taught from such a very young age and then just sort of reinforced in other ways in schools and with parents and
yeah,
whatnot. So it can be challenging. But with books like this, at least there's conversations being had and sort of deconstructing, those ideologies. And like you said, what's the big deal with, a
yeah.
little boy wanting a flower on his hand, or if he wants to wear pink, or if he wants to wear a dress?
Like, so what? Like, why are we fighting? Why are we, continuing this violence, especially against boys? Because then they grow up to be men who have, like, again, intense amounts of like toxic masculinity. They
Hmm.
become violent where they might be abusive and aggressive to women. Like, I'm not saying, this book is going to solve all that, but what I'm trying to say is like when we create an environment where things were for boys, they need to like cars, they need to like blue, girls need to be blah blah blah. Like then we create even later on in life this idea that like, you know, men need to act a certain way. And I'm sure you as, a gay man and me as a queer person that like we've also needed to play into that too for survival to an extent,
Hmm.
but it doesn't really serve anybody. It is just continuing cycles of violence. And that's not cool. But we could just create softer boys or hone in that femininity in boys, or not even femininity, but the artistry.
Hmm.
And just saying like, hey, you're a kid, you're a child. Let's accept you for who you are. If this is your art form that's preferred, let's do it.
Yeah, and let's not
And
label it as this is for
no,
girls or this is for boys.
exactly.
Hmm.
And let's not label, this book is inherently queer either. I think that's not fair either, because I think ultimately it's not, you know?
Yeah,
So,
there's no mention of that in the book.
no,
Hmm.
yeah,
Um, Zane, what was it like to share this book with your parents? And I understand, and I'm very sorry to hear that your father unexpectedly transitioned, but I do believe from what you wrote in a post that you had an opportunity to share it with him before he transitioned and with your mom. I always say the word transition because I honestly believe no one actually ever dies,
mhm,
that our relationship with them continues, and that death is just the beginning of a new relationship with our departed loved ones on the other side. So coming back to my question, what was it like to share the book with your parents and what was their reaction?
absolutely. Before I even share that, I will say that interestingly enough, this Nowruz will be 10 months to the day my dad unexpectedly passed away last year. So it's been a very rough ride because again, it was unexpected, it was not something we saw coming. Um, but luckily, as you correctly pointed out, I did get to share an advanced review copy. So not all the pictures were in there, but it was more or less the same book that my dad and my mom got to read together um, around this time last year. So it would have been around a year ago. Um, and I don't know if this is just an immigrant dad thing, but my dad is a very introverted person. Um, he never necessarily shared that like he was proud of me specifically in those words,
Mhm.
but I think he definitely was when he got to when my mom read it out to him, and I think he was proud of the stuff that I did. And I remember even if it was like me singing a Ganan, which is like a hymn at the Ismaili Jamaat Kana, and people would come up to him to say, "Oh, Zain did a great job." He was always keen on being like, "Make sure you go and tell him yourself." Like that was really important for him, and he was a huge supporter of mine as well in the sense that he was a very hardworking, supportive father, and I'd actually like to go into a bit of another discussion about, in Mehndi Boy, you'll notice that like there is a father who's in the story, and he's in one of the illustrations and or one or two of the illustrations, and but it doesn't really have much talking,
Hmm.
which is interesting. And I think initially I wrote it maybe with some anger, because I think I've always struggled with my relationship with my father in the sense that like he always loved us. But again, brown men don't really know how to say they love you. And I
That's
think that
true.
was hard. I'm a
Hmm.
Cancer, I'm emotional, I'm sensitive.
Hmm.
Hearing, words of affirmation is definitely that love language of mine. And so
Hmm.
I initially was like, you know what? Like the dad in this story too is not really gonna have a big part of it. But in doing so, the entire story is still about a fatherly love, but from the uncle. Aya's uncle then becomes this focus for Tehzeeb of being a favorite uncle, but it's still very much this like older father-like figure. And I think ultimately is a relationship with a father figure with a young boy. So even though we're calling him an uncle, it's very much still a relationship that a young boy has with his dad.
Hmm.
And so even for me writing this, it didn't dawn onto me until much later on. I'm like, oh, Zane, you still wrote a book that was basically about a little boy and his dad, or his uncle for that matter. And, you know, semantics aside, it's still about that relationship. And so while it has been a really hard, 10 months almost, in a couple of days till the 21st of March, Um, I know my dad is, like you said, is transitioned to, be a part of the universal soul, like very much has returned to the creator and part of that spark that is in all of us. He is now with us. And just as your family members that might have passed are still with us and with you. So I think there is pride. I think there's just sometimes you don't have the language to express because of generations where that wasn't a thing.
Hmm.
The love was shown through like cut up pears and apples that were brought to your room. The love was shown by, doing your laundry. The
Hmm.
love was shown by like helping start your car before you need to venture out in a blizzard. The love was shown by making sure you never had to pump gas. And I had to learn how to do that once he passed away. And the love was shown through really um, enabling your child to be queer and loving them. And my younger brother, who had a much closer relationship with my dad than I, is very, very queer in his own way. Has long hair, wears a lot of feminine clothes. He like even before just a couple of weeks before my dad passed, was joking. He's like, you know what, Keon, like what if, you just change your name to Kiana and, you be a girl? Like, it made a kind of a joke like that with him and like, change your name to Kiana. Like, so what? Like, kind of was very much like being like, just do you, like, who cares? And I love that my dad had two queer kids and loved us so deeply. And his legacy continues with us to this day. There's not a day I don't remember him, and there's not a day that I don't think of that. He's still with us, and he's still very much interceding in many senses for us. And I even think about another cousin that I lost 40 days after my dad, 42 days after my dad, Shirzana Mita, who passed away after having 5 extra years with a double lung transplant.
Hmm.
Um, Amazing soul who fought super hard and made such a lasting impact on me and my family. And I think about these people, and sometimes in my time of need, just how I would call upon Allah or Hazrat Ali as an intercessor. I often do call upon these Ruhani or these departed souls in the Ismaili tradition and pray for them
Hmm.
because they now have returned. They are now a part of that universal soul or intellect that, they've gone back to their creator. They've gone back to that merciful aura, that energy that we all once came from. And
Hmm.
so They are proud of me. And even though they both unfortunately could not be there for the launch, I know Shirzana ordered the book. I know she ordered it from Amazon, and her last words to me on Instagram were that she loved me. And a couple of days later, her health actually went really down around my birthday time. And then I think by, Canada Day, the day after, she passed. And so, even though we were dealing with so much loss and grief and it's been hard, knowing that I have people in another realm who are rooting for me, who love me, who I was honestly able to meet in this life.
Mhm.
And also dealing with like literally I'm gonna use the word fuckery, if that's okay,
That's okay.
of dealing with all the gender norms that come out at times of funerals. Instantly I'm being told, oh, you're the man of the family. And I'm like, I don't even identify as a man half the time. I'm like a non-binary person,
Mhm.
like this idea that like I'm barely like even scratching the surface sometimes, and you guys are telling me I'm the man of the house. You're not even letting me grieve the death of my father, but I'm being told, I need to now be this father-like figure to my brother, and I need to be like this man of the house to my mother. I'm like, no, my mom is the one who's next in command, not me.
Mhm.
This was her husband, and I deserve every right to also grieve my father. So it was really jarring, right? And having a launch of this book, though, was an immense amount of happiness that I simultaneously was almost forced to still celebrate during such a like very sad, chaotic couple of months. And like 4 months later, after my dad passing, I'm launching a book, and it was sad. I dealt with a breakup too, which sucked, right? Like a week before my dad's passing, I was on a new medication that was really screwing up with my like everything. It was a
Mhm.
lot of transition, but my friends came together. My friends came to support me. They came to make masala chai. They picked up samosas. They made a cake for me. They did the mehndi at my launch at a different book list. They did so many incredible things for me. They came out, 40, 50 well-wishers, some of them family, extended family, friends. So many beautiful souls came out to support me. And I'm so confident that a lot of this is because of the intercession of my beloved family members who have passed on and transitioned to that new evolution of their existence. And one day I will join them too.
Mhm.
And I'm a deeply spiritual person. And so this question was a hard one, but I hope that kind of does justice um, to your question.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for sharing that and for your vulnerability. I can relate to the grief journey, and I can only share my experience thus far. And it feels like it will be a lifelong journey. And there are moments where you could grieve and laugh, and there's moments where you can grieve and cry, and there's moments where you can grieve and celebrate, and all of that is normal. And there is just absolutely no right way to grieve. Your experience will be unique to yours, and you can express it any way that you feel you need to. And having the type of friends that you do that can hold space for you and just support you through a grief wave or a celebration is really important. So, leaning on people when you need to and sharing your story, because I know it'll help with others as you're so good at. And I really appreciate what you just said. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Zane, your book has had some incredible praises. And to shift gears, one which came from a singer that you mentioned named Ali Sethi. And he says, Mehndi Boy feels warmly familiar and highly original at the same time. I was totally charmed by it. What was it like to read that comment, especially coming from someone who I can see from your Instagram that you certainly appreciate as an artist, his artistry, and just from the things that you said about him in today's episode.
Of course. I was very honored, honestly. Ali, I think Ali's also been on his own evolution through his artistry, and Pasuri was the most Googled song of 2022. Like, again, most Googled song. Like, it's a pretty rad endorsement to get from him. And I was really glad and feel so honored to have that. And as you know, like, um, Ali Sethi has been a favorite singer of mine for a couple of years. And I mentioned a lot of those Sufi Awliya and saints earlier. And I was remiss to share that it was truly because of Ali Sethi and his Misaki Ishq tour. So when he first kind of started out, he had done a tour, one that went to the Aga Khan Museum, where he brought Ali Asani, who was a very famous Harvard professor who's done extensive work on the Ghanaic literature of the Smiley community, beyond these Smileys as well. So Harvard professor, and then you have Ali Sethi on stage as well, who is singing a lot of beautiful Sufi works on love, on ishq. Um, and there was so much intentionality behind who he's saying, what he's saying, and Ali Asani was able to then provide context on who was brought on stage. And when I tell you this was like a life-changing day for me. It was a life-changing day for me because at that point, I really had just begun my journey into my queerness. But when I learned about Siraj Aurangabadi, when I learned about Shah Hussain through Ali Sethi's work and through him being on stage and like really platforming these specific figures from South Asian history, I was in shock. And it really was the catalyst for me in many ways to, one, connect with myself and really learn about who these figures were, do my own research, but then really come to terms with my queerness. Again, moving away from the narrative that it's something Western, it's something brand new, that the rainbow-colored flag people are out to get you and brainwash your kids and
Hmm.
you know um and again we have to think really like white capitalistic the gays for that and homo pink nationalism for that, but we have so many traditions within our own cultures that are queer, if we want to use that term, even though it's not the best term to use, but that were against the grain, that were not your stereotypical heterosexual relationships that expressed gender and played with gender. And so Ali Sethi honestly was and is a huge inspiration, and I'm honored to like made his, friendship and acquaintance. And
Hmm.
whenever he's in town, I've been lucky to like, find a way to give him a hug or say hi. So he's been huge in my journey, and I'm a huge like lifelong um fan. And in a way, like not everyone gets to meet their idol,
Hmm.
but he has been an idol for me in many ways because of the work he's been doing in the Pakistani context and beyond. And the diaspora beyond just this very like partition idea. I think people across the world, including the Caribbean, including like various parts of, North America, Europe, have been so excited to listen to his work. And so I'm thankful for him for being a catalyst on my journey.
Yeah, and I can appreciate everything that you've said about him. I've just only recently come to learn about him and his music, and it was mainly because he recently released a collaboration with Bollywood singer Janita Gandhi.
Hmm.
And I worked with Janita Gandhi on a project. I got to personal train her for a video shoot that she was doing. And when that song came out, it was the first time I heard him sing, and I was floored by his talent. He has an incredible range. And I will definitely be adding a lot of more of his tracks to my Spotify playlist because he
You are
is
very late to the game, but
incredible.
that's
I
okay.
know. I know. Like, how did I miss the most Google artist of, was it 2023?
2022, yeah.
2022? Yeah.
I would also recommend, so my initial falling in love with his voice, my mom actually sent me his first song, Umran Lagiya,
Hmm.
which is Coke Studio. And when I listened to his voice for the first time, without having any idea of who he was or his work, his politics, or anything, I was like, there is some queer dard, some pain in that voice. And I mean, I wasn't wrong.
Right.
And so he is incredibly talented. And I often say the most talented people are probably queer because there's something of our experiences that really transmutes. Well, we need to transmute our pain somehow, and it's often
Mhm.
through the arts. And Janita Gandhi, incredibly talented. Also, we have a Peel Region connection. I
Mhm.
remember listening to her perform at Celebration Square, learning that she's originally from, you know, this
Brampton.
area. Yeah, and it
Yeah,
was
she's from
so
Brampton.
amazing. And so I'm so glad that there's a connection there. And that song, a
Mhm.
banger,
Right?
and love the video, love the imagery, love the
Yeah.
UK kind of like vibe. It was
Yeah,
incredible.
the video was shot in London, and
Mhm.
just this morning, Janita posted a video of her with Ed Sheeran, and she's playing the track for him, and he's listening to
Oh,
it.
that's so cute.
And I was like, way to go, Janita. That's my girl.
Amazing.
Thane, oh my goodness, I could keep talking to you for hours. And I want to also be respectful for your time, but I've really, really enjoyed this conversation. I've learned so much from you. I cannot thank you enough for sharing this book into the world, for your art, your poetry, your activism, for all that you do for us, for our communities. You have inspired me in so many ways. I want to dive into more history relating to our queer ancestors a little bit more, and maybe you can guide me through that. I would love to get a playlist from you of Ali Seti's music, of some of your favorite tracks. So please share that with me. And by all means, if we ever get a chance, I would love for you to do some Mehndi on my hand or anywhere else, like on my back, whatever. But I would love for you to do that. I'd love to experience the author of Mehndi Boy share his artistry as a Mehndi artist on me at some point. But before we end this episode, I'd like to wrap up with having you read just one more excerpt from your book.
Absolutely. And before I begin, I just want to thank you again for this opportunity. And truly, like, this was an amazing conversation. And who knows, maybe I'll be back for after my next book or something. And totally happy to chat with you
Listen, if
again.
you are available, I will book you. 'Cause you're
I'm
such
down.
you're a busy guy, but I
I
will
know.
make the time to speak to you. You can count on it.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's read a little bit more. Thezib tried to stay as still as a sculpture. He watched as she delicately drew daffodils and daisies, painted perfectly teardrop-shaped paisleys, checkered diamonds along his fingers, and filled every last space with vines, squiggles, and the coolest complicated patterns. Before he knew it, she had covered his hand with a glamorous garden. A garden that reminded him of the Navroz card he'd made on the car ride there. Tizib's heart danced. He'd always loved drawing designs in his sketchbook, but now it was as if his hands were the paper, and the more he stared at his palm, he could almost feel it come to life. He knew he had to try it for himself. He knew he had to try it for himself.
That was Zain Bandali, and the book is titled Mehndi Boy. I will have in the description of this podcast where you can contact Zain and where you can also pick up a copy of this book. Zain, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Farhan. Take care.
Bye bye. I'm Farhan Dalla. Thank you for taking the time to listen to today's episode of Elevate Your Life, a transformational podcast. I hope today's conversation has elevated you in some way and inspired you to connect, move, and meditate. I'd really appreciate your support by following and rating this podcast. Come back soon and join me for another transformative conversation.